Under klimatoppmøtet i Paris i desember 2015 så var jeg så heldig å kunne sitte inne i de innerste rommene sammen med det franske formannskapet og den norske klimaministeren. Og der var det ikke USA og Kina som pushet mest på, men det var næringslivet som virkelig pushet på for å få en ambisiøs klimaavtale. Vår neste taler jobber nettopp for FNs klimakonvensjon, UNFCCC, og han har sagt: The building and construction industry is a key actor for enabling the successful implementation of the Paris Agreement. Niclas Svenningsen, han manager for Strategy and Relationship Management i UNFCCC. Han har også jobbet for FNs miljøprogram, UNEP. Og Niclas, vær så god, kom opp på scenen. Du vil trekke linjene til byggenæringens arbeid med å bidra til å oppfylle Paris-avtalen. Du svensk, arbeidsspråket på engelsk, så da blir det på engelsk i dag, selv om du vel fra Karlstad, eller noe sånt. Ja.
Det blir som det blir. God morgen alle sammen. Standing here feels a little bit like being King Kong, you know, so I'll try to not rip the scene apart. So anyway, mitt namn Niclas Svenningsen. Jag talar svenska, danska, inte tillräckligt bra norska för att presentera på norska. So I hope you're all okay with me speaking English. Maybe I should start by just try to reflect a little bit on why are we here? Why is United Nations at ByggReisDeg in Norway? The reason is quite simple, actually. Buildings and construction is front and center of the climate agenda internationally and globally. If you look at buildings and construction globally, some 30% of all energy produced is actually used in buildings. And some 20% of all greenhouse gases are coming from buildings. And that is only a snapshot of what we have today. If you're looking into the future, you will see that because we are actually getting more income and better conditions in developing countries, the energy use in buildings is going to increase. In addition, the floor area is going to double over the next 3 decades to 415 billion square meters globally. If you look at that from that perspective, this sector is a huge problem for the climate change agenda. But that's only one part of the equation. On the other side, it's also a huge solution for the climate change problem. And the reason is this. Many years ago, I worked myself as a civil engineer in a construction company in Sweden. And already at that time, and I was only there for a short time, but I could see how fast development is going in this sector. We have moved from good buildings to energy-efficient buildings to zero energy buildings to net positive energy buildings in only a few decades. And we are doing this with technologies such as improved ventilation, better insulation, smart metering, smart lighting, better city planning, better operation of the buildings. Technology is certainly not a problem for this sector. The problem is to get us to use that technology to bring down the climate footprint of the building construction sector. And I think this is also why it's so very, very important, because we all know that we are competing in a market where some organizations or company may choose to not be so sustainable so that they can undercut and get lower prices and basically win the competition. So that is why we need to have good policies, smart regulations, incentives that are putting the bar at a level where sustainable and energy climate smart buildings is not that little bit extra. It is a thing that we all have to do all the time. But let me start actually talking a little bit more about the Paris Agreement. You probably heard about this. Paris Agreement was an agreement between 197 parties to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to limit the global climate change to far below 2 degrees above the levels we had about 100 years ago, pre-industry. The implementation of this agreement is the responsibilities of the parties, of the national governments. And each government has developed an action plan where they are describing how they are going to reduce a certain amount of emission within a certain amount of years. These action plans will be updated every 5 years until we actually really reach that target. Why 2 degrees, you may ask? Well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but basically what science tells us is that if climate change exceeds 2 degrees, we are going to get serious interference with a number of those ecosystems, which is the basis for life on our planet. So obviously, we don't want that. So that is where I want to improve that. The reason why the Paris Agreement is fundamental is not only that we have 197 governments agreeing on something, on anything actually. Trying to get them to agree what is a nice flavor of ice cream is bad enough. But this agreement is actually not an agreement for the people working with climate change. It is an agreement that will affect all sectors of society, from industry to transport to energy to agriculture, and certainly also the building and construction sector. 90 of the governments that have submitted their climate action plans to us in UNFCCC have singled out the building construction sector as a priority sector to address. Some of you may say, well, sounds good, but doesn't the Paris Agreement already unravel? Didn't President Trump of the United States tweet something about withdrawing the United States out of the Paris Agreement? Well, he did. We were not happy. But the very same day, we received calls from almost all our other parties saying that we are certainly in this Paris Agreement and we're not leaving. More important, though, is that in the United States, very quickly, a coalition of states, major cities, and major companies formed. They call themselves We Are Still in Coalition. And what they said is that no matter what the national, federal policies of the United States is, we are going to implement the Paris Agreement within our jurisdiction, at the city level, at the state level. And this is important because that is where action will have to happen. That is where emission reductions really will have to happen. It is the companies, it is the cities, it is the local communities, it's you, it's us who have to do this together. The role of the governments is to provide the level playing field that makes it easy for us to implement actions. But really, it is at our level that action will have to happen. 3 weeks from now, we have the 23rd Conference of the Parties, COP23, in Bonn in Germany, where I'm working. We will have about 30,000 participants to this 2 weeks meeting. And the first time ever, the majority of the work is not going to be on more negotiations, but it's going to be on something we call the Global Climate Action Agenda. It is an agenda where we have major sectors from around the world coming together to work for days and develop specific recommendations to policymakers at the national level about what policies they need to be able to implement climate action at the ground. And again, one of those sectors is human settlements, building and construction. So, yes, the Paris Agreement is quite relevant for this sector, but it's actually one part of the story. The wider part of the story is, of course, the Global Sustainable Development Goals. And I know this is United Nations lingua, and maybe it doesn't really mean so much, but you do know that sustainable development was defined by your former Prime Minister, Gro Harlem Brundtland. And definition is simple this. Bärkraftig utveckling definieras som en utveckling som tillfredsställer dagens behov utan att ödelägga framtida generationers möjlighet till att tillfredsställa sina behov. It looks at 3 levels. It looks on economy, environmental protection, and social equity. And this was taken up only a few months before the Paris Agreement was concluded. The United Nations General Assembly in New York agreed on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It contains 17 goals related to poverty, education, hunger, economic growth, protection of environment, and so on. And I want to read a little bit from the preamble to the agenda, just to give you a taste of the spirit that this agenda is forging. This agenda is a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity. It also seeks to strengthen universal peace in larger freedom. We recognize that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, is the greatest global challenge and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. All countries and all stakeholders acting in collaborative partnership, will implement this plan. We are resolved to free the human race from the tyranny of poverty and want to heal and secure our planet. We are determined to take the bold and transformative steps which are urgently needed to shift the world onto a sustainable and resilient path. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the ambition that we have to deal with. It's the right ambition, and buildings and construction is just in the center of it. My next slide is, with my thanks to the World Green Building Council. It's very illustrative on how building construction are interacting with some of the sustainable development goals defined in the 2030 agenda. For example, goal number 3 says everybody should have access to get good health and well-being. Well, green buildings is a way of ensuring, and it's actually a requirement for making that possible. Goal number 7, affordable and clean energy. Well, we know that buildings can be energy zero, they can be energy positive. The energy issue does not need to be a big problem if you have the right buildings. Goal number 8, decent work and economic growth. Well, green buildings, the building sector today already contributes some 10% of global employment. And much more can be done there as well. And so on. I'm not going to go through the whole slide, but I would encourage you to have a look on the World Green Building Council's homepage. I have a lot of interesting facts here. So all this sounds good, right? But what is actually reality here in Norway? How does this really, really relate to us here? I mean, we're doing quite well here in Norway. Indeed, we are. But let me suggest a few things, and these are things you probably already know. If we are going to achieve the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to have a few things. We need to have the policies that are providing a level playing field for the industry and construction sector to be able to address the climate change. We need to recognize that most of the buildings we'll have in 2050 are already there, and they are not good enough. So we have to accelerate the renovation of the existing building stock. We also need to improve the performance of all new buildings. They should at least be net zero energy when we are building new buildings. We know that we need to improve the management and the operation of buildings. No matter how good building you have, if you don't have the right way of operating it, it's going to not work so well. We also know that over time we need to start looking into new materials. Being a civil engineer myself, I am kind of married to concrete and steel and aluminum. But the fact is that these are not very climate-friendly materials. And there are a host of new materials coming up. I was in China only 2 weeks ago on a low-carbon expo. There are 5 large companies presenting new construction materials that had more or less the same capabilities and conditions as concrete and steel. So much is happening there. Over time, we also need to start thinking about what is going to happen with Norway's climate. In Norway, we are a country where most of the building stock is by the sea. And we can be sure that we are going to see some kind of climate change affecting the Norwegian building stock. How do we make sure that we are ready for that? So my point is this. Buildings and construction in a business-as-usual scenario may be trotting along here in Norway and all over the world. But if we are going to implement the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Agenda, and we are, because this is what the governments have committed to do, we need to accelerate renovation, we need to improve performance. And in there, it's a huge business opportunity for this sector. It's a business opportunity here in Norway, but it's also a business opportunity for the world, because the world is hungry to learn and understand what can be done in this sector globally. So what are other countries doing? Well, I could tell you about energy efficiency standards being implemented in Brazil, South Africa, New Zealand. I could tell you about the phase-out of incandescent light in Thailand and India and China. I could tell you about completely new approaches to building buildings in Morocco or in France. But I don't want to do that, because you will hear about that anyway, I'm sure. What I want to do is to give you a little bit tale of 2 cities. It's not Charles Dickens, it's not 1859, although it's a great tale. No, this is a story about Arendal and New York. Arendal is a small city in a country called Norway. 45,000 people are living there. And they have always been a little bit of a pathfinder when it comes to climate action. In 2008, the community of Arendal said that they wanted to become climate neutral. The way they did this was to measure the climate footprint, to start implementing plans for reducing it, and then to compensate the rest by investing in emission reduction projects abroad. That cost money. And that turned out to be a good thing because money is always a driver. So if you have a carbon price on your climate footprint, you will automatically start to look for solutions to reduce the climate footprint. Now, today, 8 years later, the climate footprint of Arendal is 1,500. So from 7,000 to 1,500 in less than a decade. It's pretty good. And what Arendal did earlier this year was that they said, okay, we have done this now for the municipal buildings, the public transport. Now we want all companies, all organizations, everybody in Arendal to become climate neutral. And they joined the Climate Neutral Now initiative that we are running in UNFCCC only a couple of months ago. On the other side of the world, you have New York City. New York City is slightly different from Arendal. There are 8.5 million people living there. The annual climate footprint is about 50 million tons of CO2. And only 2 weeks ago, the City Council adopted a plan that they call 1.5 degrees, aligning New York City with the Paris Climate Agreement. They basically commit to cut emissions in the city by 80% from 2005 to 2050. And they commit to climate compensate for the rest, for what they can absolutely not avoid. It's very much the same approach as Arendal is taking here. They are looking at building standards, they are looking on public transport, they are looking on lighting, they are looking on city planning policies to implement this. And they are looking to a large extent also to the introduction of electric cars. They are immediately investing $10 million in fast charging stations all across New York, and within the next 5 years they're going to increase that by 5,000%. So when you see this kind of actions in Arendal and in New York, I think it's not, two examples. It's actually a trend, and we do see a lot of cities taking this trend. So I would say it's just as well that we're getting ready for what is coming. Now, let me just give you a really bad example. When I was preparing this presentation, I found out that the least sustainable city in the world is also in Norway. It's actually in Bergen, and I'm very sorry to say that it looks like this. After a month, it looked like this, and I hope this is not what we want to have in the United Nations. Anyway, so to wrap this up, what we are talking about is local action by you in a global framework to help yourself, but also to help the world, to develop the new solutions, to show that it can be done in practice. And I think that this meeting here, ByggReisDeg, is the perfect opportunity to come together to discuss how this can be done and to send the signals to the policymakers of Norway and of the world that we are ready and we will do it. Thank you very much.
Takk, Niclas Svenningsen, for et inspirerende foredrag. Og det er ikke lenger enn 2,5 år siden jeg satt i et møte i Utenriksdepartementet for å diskutere nettopp hvordan vi skulle få oppmerksomhet rundt det som etter hvert da skulle bli FNs bærekraftsmål. De var på langt der ferdige, og jeg skal innrømme at jeg tenkte dette er diffust, dette er litt småkjedelig, wishy-washy, dette kommer ikke til å engasjere folket. Men der tok jeg altså feil så det suste. Over hele verden, som vi så her, så har altså sektor på sektor innen næringslivet nå begynt å integrere alle eller noen av FNs bærekraftsmål i sine forretningsstrategier og forretningsplaner.